Quorum, that's why we're starting a little late. But let me start with some intro remarks. Tonight we're hearing from Pam McKinney, who's sitting to my right, my left, as you're facing us. I kind of have to turn myself around. This meeting is going to be a little different than some of the meetings we've had in the past. And it's going to be different than the meetings we're having going forward, because we're not going to be seeing any developer presentations. We're not going to be hearing from the developers, and the committee is not going to be making any decisions tonight. But what we're doing is getting a financial analysis of the two projects that this committee has been asked to analyze. And this will provide the committee and the public information that we can use to analyze the projects and push back perhaps on the developers. And we can see where we stand and in relation to how far we can push. So this is going to be an important meeting, but as I said, there aren't going to be any decisions made tonight. I've heard some people referring to this as a public hearing. This is not a public hearing. This is a public meeting. I'm anticipating that Pam's presentation is going to be quite long and detailed, and if you're not into the finances of real estate, it's probably going to be quite dry. But
I promise to make it as entertaining as possible.
But it's information we need to have, and it really kind of sets the framework. You know, money makes the world go round, and in the real estate world, that's ever more crucial and important. Right now I'm dancing. I'm trying to stretch the time a little until we get a quorum, because we can't really conduct business until we get a quorum. So one thing, we had a request. We had a request to get the largest room in town hall, and I suspect the weather and being that this is August has kind of held the crowd down. But every room has its advantages and disadvantages. This room, the advantages are, you know, we can seat more people. The problem with this room is we kind of have to be around microphones. It sets up a kind of a level of formality that maybe that's a good thing. I'm more comfortable in a more informal setting. You know, this is the room we use, you know, for the selectmen meetings, which tend to be formal. So what I'm going to remind the committee, if the committee has questions, you need to reach for a microphone and speak into the microphone. I anticipate not really having time for public comment, but if there is time, we'll take public comment, and I would suggest that keep it to the financial analysis. You know, talking about whether the projects are good projects or not good projects. I don't think this is the meeting for that. This is the meeting to talk finances. So with that said, I think I've kind of stretched it as much as I can stretch it.
I could save you for a couple of minutes anyway. In addition to identifying a larger room to have the meeting, we also received requests for hard copy printed documents for folks that might need them. So if you need those, raise your hand. I have them up front. I'm happy to stop by and circulate them. We also have a listening device if you should need that. I can give that to you. And going forward, we'll do our best to make sure we're able to accommodate all meeting attendees. The meeting is being recorded by Brookline Interactive Group. It's not live, it's being recorded. That was another request we had for folks that weren't able to attend tonight. So once the meeting is recorded, it'll be posted online and a link will be available for that. I think that's about it in the way of housekeeping.
So just future meetings that we've scheduled?
Yep, we have several meetings scheduled over the next few weeks. Next week is the Holiday Inn Subcommittee of the Coolidge Corner Study Committee meeting, where the developer will be giving a presentation of their most recent proposal. Same presentation that was given to the neighborhood a few weeks ago. We also have a Waldo Durgan Subcommittee meeting scheduled for August 15th. And then following that, there's a full committee meeting scheduled for September 7th. All those meetings are at 7 o'clock. And the rooms are to be determined at the moment because we're trying to finagle things on our end. Conference rooms are at a premium in Brookline. We all held our breath for a minute. We thought that was Kathy.
It was still one short of a quorum.
But we can hold voting on the minutes until Lauren and Kathy show up, and I think we should probably dive into the presentation so we
Okay.
make the best use of everybody's time. Do you want to just go in, or so? If the committee remembers, almost exactly 2 months ago, Pam came in and met with us to give her preliminary sort of first peek assessment at the development proposals. At that time, the proposals were a little bit different. They've since evolved, and we've gotten a flavor from that from both developers as they both hosted neighborhood meetings over the last 5 or 6 weeks. 6 weeks that were pretty well attended. Pam has been in communication with both developers as their proposals have evolved, so her analysis is based on the latest information. And when we met with Pam a couple of months ago, she walked away with some specific requests to test the feasibility of these projects under certain circumstances, testing different uses, all in an effort to help this committee understand, as Neil said, where we can push and pull and influence the projects to improve them, both in terms of scale and other variables that impact a project, parking, uses, program, et cetera. So Pam took that information away, and now she's here again tonight to give us her second look analysis at the sites, again, having had a chance to discuss with the developers their most recent iteration of their project. And this is information that the committee will use to help decide how to move forward on either project and to try and see if we can make something work on either site. So with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Andy. Again, my name is Pam McKinney, for those of you who don't know or don't remember me. As Andy said, the intent of the work that I've been doing here is to try to provide information. It's not to express an opinion about whether the projects are good or bad or indifferent, and it's certainly not to suggest any specific recommendation that anybody should accept them as they are. It's simply to provide some understanding of how the projects work financially, how do they fit in their markets, how aggressive or conservative are they with respect to the way that the costs and revenues have been portrayed, and essentially to test them against the marketplace, to be satisfied that what is being proposed fits in that market context. And so the basic analysis, again, just to remind folks, and I'll do this, is to analyze the projects from a financial and market point of view. The basic analytic framework, and I promised I would try to make this entertaining, but I'm clearly not. I'm not succeeding yet. The basic analytic tools are pro forma financial tools, which means that we look at the cost of the project in all of its various components. We look at the revenue potential of each project in all of the various kinds of revenues that are being proposed. And of course, in both of these cases, that means we're looking at residential revenue potentials and hotel revenue potentials, and I'll come to in a few moments to some of the other things that we've looked at beyond that. And also to look at the expenses associated with operating them so that we have some understanding of how the cost on the one side is supported by the net revenue potential of the programs. And as some of you may recall, Ken Lewis did a very nice job, I thought, of doing a little Real Estate 101 course. And so my efforts here are not to try to retread that ground because Ken's done that, but to try to help describe what the results of my analyses are using the tools that Ken talked about with you all a couple months ago. Just so that we're clear on the scope of what I've done before I launch into, as Linda said a few minutes ago, the big reveal. We have analyzed the highest and best use of each site, both as improved, and of course, in the case of Waldo Durgan, the existing improvements don't amount to much. Conversely, on the 1200 Beacon Street site, analysis of the existing hotel as it sits is it's important to understand that. We've also, of course, looked at the sites as if they were vacant, that is to say, from the perspective of what one might do with them absent their existing improvements. We've also looked at the financial feasibility and market feasibility of several different kinds of uses, as I mentioned. Hotel, apartment, and condo, and commercial uses are prominent. But we've also done a little bit of thinking about some other options that are out there, not to suggest that that's what the developers are proposing, but I think it's important to at least have some understanding of what alternative concepts might yield. So we've done some looking at that. And finally, we have done, I guess what I would call financial feasibility or sensitivity tests to try and understand what the impacts are of different approaches to land use, different approaches to use mixes. As you know, these projects are both mixed-use projects, looking at different parking approaches and ratios at different densities, at number of stories, height, and of course public benefits, and actions that might be taken to mitigate impact. And I think in that public benefits category, there are sort of two kinds of things that I've been thinking about. One is what are in the projects with respect to improvements that are being proposed that would have some public utilization, whether it's open space or public meeting space. And of course, there is the ever important issue of what the real estate tax ramifications would be, both just pure, but also in terms of how different they might be under the current proposals than what is currently being collected. So we'll be talking a little bit about that too. So let me just dive in here and talk a bit about, and some of this is a little bit of a repeat of some of the observations that I made when we met a couple months ago, but I've got more certainty about things at this point, having delved into things in more detail. And just a couple of things, and I apologize, you should never let an economist do slides because there are always either too many numbers or too many words, and so I'll apologize for the fact that there are a lot of words on this particular slide. But I think it's important to start by just acknowledging that these sites are quite valuable, just given where they sit in Coolidge Corner. And whether that is because they're in the core of Coolidge Corner, as the 10 Waldo Street sites are, or whether they are on Beacon Street, just outside of the main business district, both of these sites have very valuable and interesting attributes for redevelopment. They're near transit. They have a lot of access to population density. They are within striking distance of the various markets that might fuel their redevelopment. So again, it's just an important thing to acknowledge that the project locations and sites are lend themselves to redevelopment, and certainly there are, shall we say, higher and better uses of both sites than what exists on them today. I think that the other points to make just about the sites themselves are that they both have some challenges in terms of accessibility, in terms of circulation. The fact that they are both proposed for mixed uses means that there will need to be, for feasibility reasons, each particular use will want to have its own identity and front door, and there are some issues with respect to financing and the separation of those uses on their respective sites that I'll come back and talk about in a little bit. But in order for them to be viable, it's important to understand that this is not a layer cake in which the uses are all stacked. It's a horizontal definition of each of the parts of the site that developers are talking about redeveloping, and that's an important aspect of this, which I'll come back to. It's also important to acknowledge that this is an urban environment. The sites are very tight, meaning they are very close to their abutting uses, parcels, which means that there is both a significant development, logistical management issue that will need to be handled in any redevelopment of these parcels in order to mitigate influence or impact on adjacent uses. And there's a cost associated with mobilization and redevelopment of these sites just because they are so tight. Things like bringing materials to the parcels, again, just to cite a sort of a simple, obvious aspect of redevelopment here. How do you stage the fact that materials are going to have to come at various times of the day, and managing of the coming and going and the coordination of all of that? Urban development is always expensive and complicated. So that's a part of what it means to redevelop either of these parcels. A couple of things that are specific, unique to these parcels that are not just generic to their urban location or even their sites. There are certain attributes of development here that we're trying to account for in the analysis. One, of course, is the treatment of parking and how it's being managed or handled. And underground parking is clearly an attribute of both of these redevelopment schemes, and it's very, very expensive to put parking underground. It's just a fact of life, and it is important to understand that any time you push spaces below grade, you're looking at something on the order of a 3 times multiplier of, if you can put that parking space in an above grade structure, it's going to cost you about a third of what it would if you push that parking space underground. And so that's an issue that affects both parcels. I would say that it probably affects the 10 Waldo Street redevelopment to the greatest extent, just because there is no subgrade parking envelope there today. That will have to be created, as contrast with 1200 Beacon Street, where there is already some underground parking. So it's a matter of redeveloping that substructure rather than having to create it from nothing. So that's a factor. The other couple of other important points about just the physical attributes here. It is significantly more expensive to build in steel and concrete than it is to build in wood. And to the extent that you are anticipating construction over 70 feet, then by definition you are invoking high-rise code, which then in turn means that you are going to be exposed to that extra cost. And so that's a factor to be considered, and we'll come back to that because there's some differences now in the revised proposals between the two sites that we'll flag and talk about. And the not the last, but one of the other important points to make just about physical attributes here is there really is a big difference between the two parcels in terms of the acquisition cost. In the case of Waldo Durgan, the existing improvements, as we all know, are relatively, shall we say, they are obsolete. They do not have really additive value. It's really land. That doesn't mean there isn't some cost of demolishing what is there now, but the improvements themselves really don't contribute much. That is in stark contrast to 1200 Beacon Street, where the ownership there acquired a fully operational, cash-flowing, profitable hotel. And the cost of that is an obstacle of sorts to redevelopment, because in order for it to make sense to tear that thing down and start over, you have to have a certain amount of density and profitability in the new proposal for it to be a justifiable decision. And so that is a very important attribute of the 1200 Beacon Street site. And again, it's just a fact of life. And I will say that one of the other hats I wear in my professional life is to work on hotel property. I look at hotels all over the country and in the Caribbean and in Florida and have been doing that now for at least a couple of decades. And I can tell you that the price that was paid is pretty much a market price for the number of keys that are present on that site today, and given its condition. It's not a either too high or too low. I don't know if you call it the Goldilocks effect. It was just right for the purchase of an operating Holiday Inn in that configuration in its current condition. So that is a legit expense that was incurred at the point of acquisition, and now the decision to redevelop it has to consider that issue. And of course, that's a much higher price than if it were just land. So anyway, I think that about covers that. I think that I also want to just say a few things about market, because it's important to understand sort of how these parcels fit in their respective markets. And some of this I said a couple months ago, and forgive me, I'm going to repeat the key points. This location in Coolidge Corner, especially as it relates to the hotel, but also with respect to residential, the proximity of Coolidge Corner to the inbound employment drivers, meaning Longwood Medical, as well as the financial district, those demand sources exert a tremendous amount of influence on how and why these sites actually have the value they do, and why redevelopment of these parcels is an attractive proposition. That demand is durable, it is robust. The downtown Boston is not going anywhere, nor is Longwood Medical, and those are critical to the feasibility and the market positioning of these sites. Transit is another important attribute of these parcels, both of them, and frankly, we think will help and can help to mitigate or minimize that expensive parking we were talking about before, but zero parking is not an option, not for them to be viable from a market perspective. They will need to have parking in order to be financeable, in order to be feasible. And that doesn't mean that they have to have the kind of parking that you'd have if you didn't have proximity to transit, or if you were in some greenfield location out on 128 or 495, but they will still need some amount of parking. Again, we'll come back to that. And lastly, the accessibility and visibility of these sites are good for all the uses that are being proposed, plus some others, and I'll talk about that in a couple minutes. The hotel market, of course, is one of the principal uses being proposed, or hotels are, and the demand for hotels is very strong. Not just in the Boston, Brookline, Cambridge locale, but in Coolidge Corner specifically. Select service and extended stay product, that's where the market is. And we're not talking about, full service Sheratons or full service Westons. We're talking about hotels that have some element perhaps of food and beverage, but it's scaled down. These properties, the market is really not favoring hotels with large amounts of meeting space. This is not a convention hotel. It's not a hotel that, these are not hotels that are going to make their living on the basis of group business. It's going to be oriented more toward business, leisure, and some aspect of group business, but business and leisure are likely to be the primary segments. So that select service and extended stay product is really where the market is. And both proponents have had professionally done market studies. I've reviewed them with an eye toward what I know about what constitutes a decent market study, and they're both talking about occupancy in the 75% plus or minus realm. That's stabilized, and they're both looking at average daily rates in the plus or minus, again, stabilized $300 per night realm, which is consistent, again, that's consistent with what we're seeing in the pro formas that we've reviewed. So they've taken their market studies to heart, and again, I think that's those assumptions, if you will, on the revenue side are right where you would expect them to be. There is a lot of select service and extended stay product planned for delivery in the market today. You've probably seen in the paper articles about hotels coming to Kenmore Square and to other, out at Cleveland Circle, other places that are proximate that will be competing with hotel product in Coolidge Corner. However, I must say that notwithstanding the coming supply, there's room in this market for both of these hotels. And that is not just me saying that, that's what their professional market consultants are saying with respect to the evaluation of the positioning of the coming supply and how these two sites will react or respond as that product is delivered over time. So while it feels like there's a lot of product coming, and there is, the impact on the market is expected to be, shall we say, of short duration. There's always some impact, but it's not an impact that one would expect to have influence negatively on the feasibility, market feasibility of either project. The proposed programs are what I would call consistent with market requirements. They're in the right location. They've got urban and transit accessibility. They're of the right type, select service, upscale, upper upscale. They're generally right sized, a couple hundred rooms proposed at Waldo, with a 50-room addition to the existing 225-room hotel proposed for 1200 Beacon. And just a note about that, the original proposals for the 1200 Beacon Street project had 390 keys, and the project is now 275 keys, which I think, frankly, is a much more comfortable size for the market, as we were saying before, but also with respect to the operational characteristics of a hotel. You don't need two hotels, it can be one hotel, and really the upshot of the 1200 Beacon Street proposal is now more in the spirit of an expansion of an existing room supply rather than the creation of a renovation of that hotel or a reconfiguration of that room block and adding another. Both projects have what we would call the right parking counts. They're between a 0.3 and a 0.5 per room. This is not a site, again, where you will expect that, tour buses full of people are gonna pull up. It's certainly not one in which you would expect people to be driving to the destination, at least not very many. That's not to say that some number of parking spaces won't be needed, but again, the counts for this kind of product and this location, I think, can be quite low. And again, the brand targets that upper upscale select service and extended stay product isn't, in my opinion, they're in the right territory. Now, we also have residential being proposed for these sites. In one case, we have a developer that has expressed their desire to build rental apartments, and that's the Waldo site. That is the developer has affirmatively expressed their desire to build rental. They are not interested in condo. There was some thought in the early conceptions of this that there might be some element of condominium units in the Waldo Street project, but that is no longer the case. Conversely, at 1200 Beacon Street, the feasibility of that project does not support rental. It's just not a viable use in that location, given the attributes of that project. And I'll come back to that in a few minutes. That project is now solidly a condo project. So that's an important evolution, if you will, in the last couple of months. And, I'll be talking about it some more, and you'll have, I know, an opportunity to talk with the developers at a subsequent meeting about that decision, but it's important to understand that they're going in different directions with respect to residential. Now, as far as demand for housing is concerned in Coolidge Corner, and I think I said this at the last meeting, doesn't matter, from a market point of view, what you might want to build, absolutely anything would work in Coolidge Corner. It is one of the most prime residential locations that one might find anywhere in we'll call it in the Boston, Cambridge, Brookline urban market. It has transit, it has an evolved, an organic business environment, it is walkable, it is all the things that developers everywhere are wishing they had and trying desperately to create if they don't have them. And it already exists in Coolidge Corner. The demand is strong across the income and age spectrums. The greatest depth of market demand is in what I would call the millennial category. Those are folks who are, call them 22 to 35-ish, 25 to 35-ish, and also strong in the empty nester cohorts. That is true. I'll say one thing just about the tenure types. The millennial category is much more prominent in the rental market. That's not to say that empty nesters aren't also a demand sector for rental, but clearly the empty nester market is going to be more prominent on the for sale side of things, and millennials less so. It's simply a matter of how much money do people have, how much money do households have. A 25 to 35-year-old household, especially given the aspects of the Brookline market from a pricing point of view, you need a lot of money for a down payment, or you need to be able to rely on the bank of mom and dad, or something that allows for that a down payment to be affordable. Whereas, of course, on the empty nester front, there's equity from downsizers, generally speaking, with equity in existing homes that can be deployed to support condominium purchases. So strong demand across the age spectrums, but a little bit of a difference in terms of how you might expect, which is the more prominent demand sector depending on what tenure type, rental or ownership. I would say that there is little product proposed in the most immediate market. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no product proposed, but in terms of the influences of new supply delivery on market feasibility, there really is, the Brookline market is undersupplied to an extreme degree, in my professional opinion, which means that the addition of new units to this market is not likely to have any impact whatsoever on the underlying supply and demand condition, at least as it relates to rental rates or occupancy, or the ability of the market to absorb the product. And I can say, because I do a lot of residential analysis throughout the urban markets, that the downtown or the urban markets especially are undersupplied, and it's a chronic undersupply. It's been undersupplied for decades. It's likely to be undersupplied for decades going forward. And that's just a fact of our having more desirability and more population, more households than we have supply to satisfy it. And, it takes a lot to get a project to market. So there are lots of impediments, we'll call it barriers to entry, for developers of competitive housing. The market viable housing types at both of these sites, again, I distinguish between market viability and financial viability. I'll come back to that in a moment. The market would be delighted to see conventional market rate condos, conventional market rate rentals, some of which might be age targeted, whether it's targeting to seniors, whether it's targeting to micro, so more, affirmatively aimed at that millennial market. There are choices, I guess, is the bottom line with respect to the market's desire for product in these locations. As I mentioned before, that's different from financial feasibility, which, again, the ability for a rental product to work at 1200 Beacon is highly questionable. It's very difficult, and I'll come back to that again in a moment. Whereas I think the product in Coolidge Corner, that's of quite a viable rental option. It could also be condo, if there were a desire for ownership housing there. But I think you kind of have to make a choice, one way or the other. It's very hard to mix those uses in the kind of building typology that we're talking about. Again, I'll come back to that. We've looked at commercial. The consumer demand for retail in Coolidge Corner is quite strong. It's less strong for that Beacon Street site. Retail likes to be concentrated. It benefits from what's called the agglomeration effect of retailers of different sorts, each contributing or attracting parts of a market, and everybody kind of circulating from retail to retail establishment. And in a linear environment like you have on Beacon Street, especially where Beacon Street is effectively one-sided, the potential for retail is, I think, much more sketchy. It's just not a strong market for retail. And I think that two-sidedness issue is a very important factor for retail. Retail where people can't cross from one side of the street to the other is a real impediment to retail success, to the business success. And you'll see, again, when we talk about the projects in particular, that even in core Coolidge Corner, there are only some parts of that site where retail is likely to thrive. It's not the kind of thing where you would simply say, oh, it's ground floor, it's Coolidge Corner, let's put retail everywhere. There are only some places that are visible, that are accessible to the rest of the Coolidge Corner market where you can imagine retail really thriving. And I guess I would also simply say that even in the most successful locations, retail rarely does a great job of covering its cost. The rental rates that are needed to support the cost of new construction are very high. And I think I would expect I think that's going to be a factor for retail in both of these projects. And that is why I think that the viability of commercial here, again, whether we're talking 1200 or 10 Waldo, are really likely to be dependent on their on-site users. That's where the demand is likely to come from, mostly to support those retail spaces. And the value of retail is, and this is true of both locations, is more in the amenity value they confer to the upstairs, not because they are going to set the world on fire with a rental, via rental income to a business that might occupy them. It's because they contribute value to hotel or contribute value to residential users in the upstairs spaces. So that's an important point. I've also looked, I will say, somewhat briefly at other uses, and I'll just make a comment about office, and I think I may have said something about this at our meeting a couple months ago. Neither of these locations is a particularly attractive market location for office. Now, that doesn't mean that if there were a bolt from the blue and you had a user who had a desperate desire to be located in either one of these locations and, importantly, was willing to pay a rent on a contract that would support the cost of construction, that office wouldn't be possible. But speculative office construction is not a viable option. You would need that build-to-suit, we'll call it, user to be, again, on a contract at a rent that would support the cost of construction. Otherwise, office is just not underwritable. Now, it's important to say that in the rental proposal for 10 Waldo, there is an element of co-work space being proposed. Again, not because it's going to set the world on fire from a rental point of view, but because it serves as an amenity to upstairs users. And at this point, I think there is not yet a decision been made about whether that is self-operated or whether that's commercially operated by a third-party operator. I think those decisions were far from, the developer is far from having a definitive idea as to how that is going to be operated, but it's important to know that that's a part of that project. So again, just something to mention. There was some discussion, again, a couple months ago about whether other sort of alternative concepts relative to housing might be possible, assisted living, independent living, micro-housing. And I think that my view would be the targeting of those markets is something that is more appropriate to being a part of a program rather than being a sole target. I think that the attributes of certainly of assisted living, that is a serious decision to go in the direction of healthcare provision, which is essentially what assisted living is. It's at least far down on that spectrum, and I think independent living is it's essentially the empty nester market that we're talking about, and when a project gets to be of the scale that we're talking about here, this is not 50 units or 25 units, or even 75 units in either of these schemes. The importance of having flexibility long-term to satisfy the market as it appears on not just for the lease-up or absorption, but down the road, is it's a serious decision to curtail the market to a single age-restricted use. And I think you can accomplish much of the same thing just by understanding that the market here for residential, again, true for both rental and ownership, maybe more so for ownership, is already that market. It is already an independent market, and restricting the project to a single tenure or cohort, I think, adds an element of risk to a project, to projects of this size that I think are not wise. Let's just say, micro units, same thing. Could a rental program, again at 10 Waldo, include some number of tiny units? Absolutely. How tiny is always the question. 300 square feet is maybe pushing it, but I think some number of studio units in a mix at the Waldo Street site, again, to accommodate essentially the affordability requirements or concerns, especially of that millennial market. But frankly, even we are observing more and more that even in the senior housing end of the spectrum, those small units are turning out to be a pretty nice solution for some number of households. Again, in the empty nester category, think about the house on the Cape, or your winter home in Boca, combined with essentially what is a pied-à-terre unit in your familiar community that you're going to spend some time at. We're seeing it in places like Seaport, even, where we always assumed that micro units were just going to be for single person, techie types, young techie types, but there is increasingly evidence that that older end of the spectrum is finding them appealing as well. So again, that housing typology within the context, especially at 10 Waldo, I think is a possibility. But just like the independent living concept, that is, I think smaller units or studio units are logically just a part of a mix, and you know that they're going to have appeal to a certain number of households, both young and old. I think that that's about all I have to say about market. In my view, the takeaways, if you will, from analyzing market are that hotel and residential uses with some element of ancillary, I'm calling it commercial space, that is really where the depth of market, the greatest demand is likely to be. And again, with respect to that resident amenity space, that could be expressed as a variety of things: some co-work space, fitness, coffee, bakery, prepared foods. There's opportunity for various kinds of commercial, but again, to serve the upstairs users of hotel and residential units, not so much as a driver for program. Another important point, and this is going to have a bearing on some of what I'm going to say about the individual sites, is that critical mass matters, both operationally and from the perspective of efficiency, of construction, and just development feasibility. And generally speaking, hotel product of the sort we're talking about, select service and extended stay, the minimum room counts that we see around 150 rooms, and I mean the minimum. Optimally, we're seeing developers produce projects anywhere from 175-ish to 2.25. In that realm is sort of the sweet spot, but again, there are minimums below which it's hard to go and still have a project that is marketable and feasible, that can attract a flag, that can attract brand desire by brands, which again, given the importance of the marketing networks that fill hotel rooms to the tune of 75% occupancy, you really, a branded hotel is really what one must have. And once you go below 150, the appeal to the brands drops off pretty precipitously. For rental, 125 units is about the minimum that we ever see for urban rental product. Now, you can go to small town environments or to greenfield sites where you've got, garden style development, where you can sometimes find projects that are a little smaller than that, but it's very rare in urban environments to see anything under 125 units. And generally speaking, the sweet spot for rental apartment development is 150 to 250. That's where developers want to be with respect to having the benefit of scale and volume to pay for all of the costs that it takes to operate. And so it's just an important point. Neither of these sites are sites where, in a rental scheme, you can expect people to build feasibly at under that 125 unit threshold. Condominiums, I generally think about that threshold as being a little bit lower, in part because each unit has more square footage, so the amount of square feet is sometimes not all that different, but the unit counts can be a little bit lower, because after all, you are selling those spaces, and the cost associated with those operational issues, quite frankly, gets passed on to ownership of individual units. And there are ways to devise a service package and so on to meet the requirements of a smaller scale project. That said, the optimal that most developers are looking for is in the 75 to 125 realm, and frankly, that is mostly a cap rather than a suggestion about how high, because I know very few developers who want to have more than 125 units because the absorption risk associated with selling them becomes outsized once you get over 100 or 125 units. And it's really just a matter of how long will it take to sell out the project. And again, the longer you're exposed to the market, anything over 100 to 125 units, you just know you've got more than a year's worth of absorption, and that is a long time to be exposed to a market, especially if your only chance to make money is by selling them. With an apartment, you have some ability to withstand the slings and arrows of the market because you're going to own it for a long term, and you may not do so well this year, but you're going to do better, theoretically at least, as time goes by. It's an easier risk to handle. So I'm going to talk about market feasible heights and so on, but I think it's better to talk about that in the context of a discussion about each of the projects individually, because in fact those are not so generalizable. Issues of how tall and how big and so on are not so generalizable as overall scale or mix or use or market type. So let's dive in to, oh, well, I guess I've got a couple of other things here that I'll say quickly before we dive into the individual unit. We've already talked about hotel parking ratios. Again, those ratios are at the low end of the ranges, I think, or I should say, ratios at the low end can best be achieved in a mixed-use program where you have some opportunity to share parking spaces among the uses. Now, I think that with both of these projects, because there is residential and hotel, there's some opportunity, I think, to manage a shared parking supply that can help to alleviate the need to build every single parking space that you might otherwise need if you had one use type or another. Multifamily apartments in urban locations are pretty solidly today around a 0.5. With a typical studio 1 and 2 bedroom mix. However, I would say that even with multifamily, if you think your market is going to be more skewed or significantly skewed toward that empty nester market, those ratios can rise because the empty nester market, generally speaking, has a car. And almost always, frankly, unless you're dealing with singletons, guess what? 2 cars. And so being able to accommodate that multifamily, the range of multifamily market cohorts is something that you want to keep your eye on. And again, there's some things about the fact that these projects have got a shared parking supply that I think could enable you to think about shared solutions that might, again, even on the residential front, help to mitigate the number of spaces per unit. In condos, quite frankly, you have to have 1 space per unit. And that's in part because the cohort there is, in fact, more dramatically focused on that empty nester market. And quite frankly, because the objective with condominiums, at least as we'll talk about in a few minutes, with respect to that 1200 Beacon Street site, the condominiums in that project actually subsidize the project. And if you don't hit the high note with pricing of those condominiums, then the feasibility of that project becomes very, very tenuous. And so that means that, you're not delivering moderate income condos here with a skinny down amenity package, with a skinny down finish package, with skinny down parking, because that isn't going to do it in terms of hitting the pricing point, the high note that is needed in order to generate that cross subsidy of, for the project overall. So again, I'll just say that out loud now. We'll come back to that. When I'm measuring for feasibility in the financials, as we'll talk about in a couple minutes, I'm using various metrics that I know Ken talked to you all about a few months ago. And the basic thresholds are, for hotel, we really have to get to, for a project to be, solidly feasible, we're really looking for what we call a return on cost in the 7.5% to 8% range. Now, what is that? That is the net income from the project, income minus the expenses, there's the net income, divided by the cost of the project. And the cost is not just the construction cost, it's all the costs required to build the project. It's the cost of acquisition, it's the cost of the hard costs, it's the cost of all the soft costs, the lawyers, the architects, thank heaven, the appraisers, the market analysts, the real estate taxes during construction, all of the things that are required, the cost of marketing, etc. All of those costs are part of the basis, and that net income divided by the total cost really needs to be in that 7.5% to 8% realm for a project to be underwritable. And that means a project that can draw debt and can draw equity sufficient to actually pay for all the costs. And if you can't get to that 7.5% to 8% return rate, you really have a project that is marginal at best. Or you got to hope that somehow there's some other, we'll call it altruistic motivation that's going to overcome the problem. Now, for apartments, that return on cost is lower, generally speaking, in part because the costs overall tend to be lower, and frankly because the market for apartments is so robust in the Boston metro market. It's so desirable that people are willing to accept a lower return because it's the scarcity of the sites and places where you can build that product drives people to accept less. But that rate of return still has to be in the 5.5% to 6% realm, or you just don't have an underwritable project. So that's an important measure. Now, as far as condominiums are concerned, the threshold, again, for feasibility is sort of like a return on cost, except you're measuring the net proceeds from the sale of condominium units against the cost. And there needs to be about a 25 or 30% margin between what it costs to build and what the net sellout is going to be in order, again, for you to have an underwritable project. And that's frankly a function of how much risk is inherent in condominium sellout. Again, that issue of you're having one shot at getting your money back, and if the market goes south, you can lose not just on the margin, but you can lose everything. And, you know, that is a factor in condominium development in general.
So the strong demand in Brookline doesn't offset that?
It doesn't allow you to underwrite a project without achieving that margin. Now, that can give you more confidence that you're going to get the margin that you need, but it doesn't obviate the need to pro forma that margin. Again, we've all seen, and maybe can even remember, markets in which we thought were fabulous in 1 6 month or even 36 months, and then suddenly they weren't. And remember that the time frame in question isn't just, gee, we open our doors on a given day and we're exposed for 12 months. You're exposed from the moment you borrow the money. So that's the full extent of a construction period, and then the full extent of a sellout. So it's imagine, think about the financial collapse in 2008. Lehman suddenly says, they're out of business, and we turned almost on a dime from being in a fabulous market to being in a market where nothing was happening. So again, it's even as good as Brookline and Coolidge Corner is, it's not a margin that you can assume will be less, but you can have more confidence about getting there, I think, in Brookline. So let's talk about individual projects, and we'll start with 1200 Beacon. And I've broken these into there's sort of two slides for each one. One speaks to the programming and the sizing of the project, and the second sheet is going to speak to the financial metrics that I mentioned before. As you may or may not know, the project is no longer as big or tall as it once was. As I said earlier, it has morphed from a 390-room hotel to a 275-room hotel, and in the bargain has become a shorter building. 5 to 7 story structure, 5 stories in the part of the project that is essentially a redo of the existing hotel building there on the corner, rising to 7 stories over the balance of the site. It's essentially 4 to 6 stories over a 1-story podium and below grade space which serves both back of the house functions for the hotel as well as the service and parking requirements for the project overall. So a smaller project. The existing, part of the existing hotel is in fact being reused. That 5-story building on the end of the site, and the fact that there is that underground building, or underground parking tray, if you will, helps to reduce the cost of the redevelopment. It is because you're not having to build all 275 units. Again, it's not to say that the existing hotel, the part that they're keeping, doesn't require a lot of renovation. It's not free, but it helps. And certainly the existing subgrade garage also helps. They're not having to excavate that from nothing. Again, the hotel count has been reduced. Essentially, it acts more like a 50-room addition to the existing hotel. And while that hotel is still quite large, as we'll talk about on the next sheet, getting that number of units into the mix is pretty essential to delivering a project that can support the fixed costs of redevelopment. And again, those costs are there irrespective of how big the project is. And again, I'll flag those for you on the next page. The commercial space in this project is limited to about 10,000 feet overall of, again, what I would regard as ancillary street front retail, including about 4,000 of which is the hotel cafe. And so 6,000 square feet roughly of space that is not directly associated with food and beverage for the hotel. That is quite a lot of retail space actually in that location, in my opinion, given the nature of that frontage as it is sort of outside of the main core of Coolidge Corner. But it helps to enliven that street front, and again, even if it doesn't produce a tremendous benefit financially, it does make the project better to have that frontage occurring on that Beacon Street side of things. The public realm improvements and we'll call it the community accessible spaces for this project include a sidewalk depth of up to 25 feet. Again, it's not 25 feet across the entire length of Beacon Street. That's an important point. I think at the narrowest it's 5 feet, so a standard sidewalk, but there are places intermittently along the frontage where there is room for things like outdoor dining, public seating areas, bicycle parking, etc. And we've been told that there is going to be some public meeting space of some description associated with the hotel, roughly 5,500 square feet, that will be made available, at least on a periodic basis, for community utilization. So let's talk financials. This project, as we mentioned before, has an extremely high acquisition value because that existing hotel is part of the acquisition basis. And I'll just tell you that the price that was paid for the existing hotel was $74 million. Now, $74 million is at least double what you would expect to see for a normal land basis, absent improvements on the site. So the difference between 30-odd million and $74 million is baked into this pro forma, and that unless the economics can support that extra cost, it's very hard to justify tearing down an existing hotel. The development costs, absent that acquisition number, meaning specifically the construction costs, are completely consistent with what we see in other hotel deals and condominium deals that we look at and are examining in other locations in this market. Again, the cost of constructing something is the same whether you're in the financial district of Boston, or you're on Brookline Avenue in Fenway, or you're at 25 Washington Street in Brookline, or whether you are in Coolidge Corner. Labor and materials don't vary by location. There are some things, though, that affect the economics or the cost, if you will, on the margin. Things like the ability to reuse the existing shell. Things like the ability to reuse the existing underground parking. Those are to the good, let's say. To the bad are costs of mobilization. Again, as we mentioned, on these tight sites, it's going to be very expensive to mobilize materials, especially materials, over the duration of a construction time frame on this parcel. It's going to be an expensive proposition to handle just the complexity of that tight site on Beacon Street. But those aren't dramatic. I would say to you that on the cost side of things, the number one factor in the viability or not of this project is that acquisition price. And indeed, even with the credits that come from being able to reuse some part of the shell and being able to reuse some part of that underground structure, that cost of acquisition is huge. The hotel revenues, again, are quite, I hesitate to say aggressive, but they're robust assumptions about occupancy at over 75% and an average daily rate at $300 per night on average at stabilization. And again, those are completely consistent with market expectations. I think that the condo revenues, and I have said this to the developer here, are somewhat conservative in my view. I think there might be a little room for taking a somewhat more aggressive stance on what market rate units in that location could sell for, provided that they have the right number of parking spaces and have the right finishes. And again, I think that's an area, again, part of what I'm trying to do here is to benchmark the financial presentation against what I know to be reasonable in the market. And as I said, I have flagged this as an area where one might take a somewhat more aggressive stance. I will tell you, however, that even with a more aggressive stance on condo revenues, the ability of condo proceeds to help cross-subsidize this project are they're just not enough. The hotel returns are far below threshold needed for feasibility on a standalone basis, and those condo sale proceeds are absolutely essential to overall project feasibility. You must have them to cross-subsidize those subpar hotel returns. And frankly, even on a blended basis, when you take the excess proceeds, after that 25% return that I've said is necessary for viable condo, and I take the excess and I say, okay, I'm going to apply that excess, back against, guess what, the acquisition cost in that hotel pro forma, to try to bring that number down and see what that does to the hotel returns, I'm 150 basis points below what that 7.5% to 8% threshold that I expect to see for a viable hotel. And so I have to say that even as presented, and even with, again, a pretty aggressive stance on the condo sale potential. You know, I'll just tell you, I'm estimating condo sale for market rate units at almost $1,300 a foot. Okay, just to give a flavor for it. Okay. And of course, there is an element of affordability in here, which is, you know, so the blend of 15% affordables at a much lower rate, and that 1275-ish of market rate condo pricing is giving me a blend of around 1,100, and so that's what's assumed here. And even with that, the magnitude of the acquisition price is swamping the ability to generate a feasible return. Now, what that says to me, and again, you'll have your own opportunity to talk to developers about their sort of motivation here and what they're trying to accomplish. What that says to me is that the project was once very big. It is now much smaller for all kinds of good reasons. But that smaller hotel, and mostly it's a reduction in the hotel envelope, less so in the condo envelope, is imperiling the feasibility of the project, even at what's been presented. So what that means is the opportunity for adding more public benefits, the opportunity for reducing scale further, simply further imperil the viability of it. And as I said, frankly, the returns are already sort of questionably low. And so again, this is not intended to be a statement that one should accept the project as it is. Do not misinterpret what I'm trying to say to you. It's just that the ability to make change on that site and still have an incentive to redevelop is quite difficult. And frankly, one might wonder, well, what's the alternative? And the alternative, frankly, is to renovate an existing hotel. So, I mean, I think, you know, the choices are to try to figure out whether or not there are things that can, whether or not the benefits in the existing project are enough, and because going lower is really not an option. But again, trying to determine whether or not they are enough in relation to the renovation of the existing. I mean, that's kind of how I perceive the choice. And I'll just say a couple things, because real estate taxes are an important part of all of this. The hotel today is generating a little under $1 million in real estate taxes. That works out to about 200, it's a $58 million assessment. That assessment is equivalent to about $258,000 per key. And just for the sake of argument, I looked at a couple other Brookline hotels, notably the Courtyard Marriott on Webster Street. That project is assessed at $335,000 a key. As you might expect, it's a much better existing facility than the Holiday Inn as it sits. If one assumes that on completion of a new hotel, you might be at 350,000. I mean, it's rare that the cost of development equals the assessment. So let's just assume that you might be at $350,000 a key by the time you're done. That would translate to real estate taxes for a 275-room hotel, the new hotel, we'll say, on the order of $1.5 million. So roughly $500,000 more in hotel real estate taxes. Again, remember, it's a 50,000 or 50-room expansion of an existing hotel, but a hotel made better than the existing. If one adds to that the assessments that one might expect for the condominium units, again, priced as I've described them, that would probably generate something on the order of $800,000 to another $1 million in real estate taxes. So overall, you're going from a little under $1 million to a little under $2.5 million. Again, this is rough justice to give you some sense of scale. You know, the assessor has certainly not blessed what I'm telling you here.
And that's just property tax, not excise, correct?
That's not excise. It's just the real estate taxes. And of course, with a hotel, you'd be dealing with something in terms of the personalty because of the FF&E. So there'd be a little bit, you know, on the hotel side, that's baked in though, Andy. The FF&E, remember that's part and parcel.
FF&E?
I'm sorry, furniture, fixtures, and equipment. Think
Thank you.
about the dresser and the bed and the linens and all of that. So again, just to scale it, you know, one might take the position that, again, just for the sake of, you know, thinking about alternatives, that 225 rooms renovated to a standard more comparable to say the Courtyard at $335,000 a key, might give you a little bit of a margin over the existing tax bill. But remember, even with more rooms at a higher rate, we're only getting $500,000 more. If we got the same unit count and it's not being improved to the same extent, it's not going to be $500,000 incremental. It's going to be something less than that, without the benefit of condo revenues generating more real estate taxes. So again, the difference between, just in terms of pure real estate taxes, the difference between a renovation and a new hotel is pretty minor.
But you said earlier that the cross-subsidization from the...
Amy, microphone?
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Your point you made was that the residential side cross-subsidizes the hotel.
Yes,
And the purchase price is set.
yes.
And therefore, improving the hotel rooms doesn't solve that problem, does it?
Well, what it means is that if you have a hotel that is already worth I'll tell you, the $74 million divided by the existing hotel count is $329,000 a key. So if you improve it, it's reasonable to assume that they'll be worth $350. You'll get more revenue as a result of the improvements. And one would expect that the cost of a renovation will drive revenue. There's plenty of room, let's just say, between the current room rates and what might be achievable to generate more revenue. So again, it isn't, it's not really a mismatch here. I think it's simply, all I'm suggesting is that the amount of benefit that you get in terms of pure real estate taxes from a renovation is substantially less, right? it's, you know, it's going to be under $500,000 incrementally more, as contrast with $1.5 million more. Okay? So again, that's just a point of, you know, again, information just to use as you think about it. What I'd like to do again is,
Pam, could
yeah.
you just clarify
Yeah, sure.
the reduced height allows the developer to avoid high-rise building codes?
Yes, it helps. It definitely, I mean, part of the benefit
It's
here.
not an accident that they picked.
No,
that
it's not
site,
an
so-
accident.
Just-
I thank you, Ken. I should have mentioned that. I mean, part of why the numbers work better than they did, I mean, you know, there's sort of a pro and a con associated with bringing that height down. One is, on the negative side, you have less envelope to help you amortize a $70 million acquisition cost. However, the cost of construction is also less, because you're not piercing that 70-foot threshold, which, as I understand, I heard from a construction friend of mine today, might, in the code for next year, might become 85 feet. So, you know, you'll notice that
I'm shocked, given the recent
Shocked.
fires.
I know. The hope for one extra story, which is essentially what that is, I think predated those little incidents, shall we say. So we'll see where it goes. But
Little incidents,
Those little
gosh.
incidents, talk to our friends at Trinity.
I wonder if, before we go on, one question
Yes.
about that. In the assumption of construction costs,
Yes.
we're assuming this is now stick-on podium, we call it. Which
Yes.
They're showing 80-foot, a 10-foot more than the 70-foot you were
Yes.
thinking is max.
Yeah, it's clear that there's anticipation of the code change.
A question about this, when you look at those costs, are you assuming the light wood TJI type of framing that we just like saw in that fire last week, or something more like a CLT, heavy timber, laminated wood type framing, which I think that we'd prefer as a town? I mean, it's a little tangential to real estate costs, but it's
Right.
relevant, right? Because I think that costs more to
Yes,
build.
it clearly does cost more. What is in the current numbers is a stick-over podium development,
Yeah,
okay?
and probably light gauge, and probably the light stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think the actual choice of the material is, you know, something that is worth having a chat with the developer
Yeah,
about.
yeah.
But it's my understanding at this point that their project is a stick-over podium construction, a la what we see everywhere.
Yeah.
So Pam,
Yes.
can they demand the high prices for condos with stick-built? I mean, most of the really high-priced condos I'm aware of are concrete. The really good ones are concrete, let
Well,
alone steel.
I would have to say, Kathy, that at a $1,250 to $1,300 a foot number, we're not talking about the high end of our market, right? I mean, while that feels like an outrageous number, the steel and concrete buildings that we're looking at are $1,800 to $2,500, and more for true high-rise. So I think that typology is actually, you know, think of it this way. You know, just as a for example, you look at projects in the South End. You know, stick-over podium projects selling in the South End for just this price point, $1,200 to $1,500. So I think it's not a disconnect in terms of the market's acceptance. I mean, I would say that it puts a certain burden on the way that the finishes are done, because you have to have sound attenuation, you have to have various things in the cost to compensate, we'll say, for the fact that you're not in steel and concrete.
Mr. Cutler?
Pam?
Yes.
In the earlier scheme that was presented in March, the developer had built out the corner at St. Paul's and had moved the entry
Yep.
to the center of the site,
The-
which I thought was very advantageous from a planning point of view.
Yep.
And I'm just wondering if there is an economic reason where they decided not to use the real estate at the corner for a building and then open up the site in the middle.
You know, I think that from my point of view, that's just in terms of measuring the economic effect of that, that's what a friend of mine would call slicing the bologna too fine. And I think what's important to acknowledge here is that it's necessary for hotel and resi to have independent entrances, independent addresses, and clear differentiation of identity. Whether that happens with an entrance mid-block or whether that happens with entrance, at the St. Paul Street corner, I think is more of an urban design choice than it is something that is going to materially affect the economics of the project. Again, if there were substantial differences because the lobby was suddenly, much smaller, or because the ability to manage the access to parking was somehow got screwed up, that's a vernacular, because of the decision about entrance, then those sorts of things could have a material impact. But the mere difference between this location or another is less of a concern, I think.
Okay.
So let's talk 10 Waldo. So similar kind of formatting here. This project, at least from the early days when we were talking, whatever it was, 18 or 20 stories, the project size is now dramatically smaller, a 9-story hotel, a 14-story multifamily apartment structure, and it is organized so that each building sits on its own pad, which, again, as you may recall from the circulation pattern, there is essentially now an interior road that comes through from Pleasant Street through the site back out to John Street. And so that now separates the site, 2 buildings, again, each on its own footprint. And that's an important point, and I should have mentioned it when we were talking about 1200 Beacon. Notwithstanding the fact that those projects at 1200 Beacon each have their own separate identities and entrances, the ownership and the development at 1200 Beacon is a coordinated thing. There's a financing that would essentially account for both pieces to enable the flow of condo proceeds that are needed for to buoy hotel feasibility to flow over onto the other side, so they aren't trapped by a different owner. In this project, the project is in 2 separate pads, which allow independent financings of the 2 projects, which from the perspective of an owner that is more in the residential side of things than in the hotel side of things, is quite advantageous, because it enables you to have a financing structure that you can partner up with someone on the hotel side to get that project done on an independent basis from the apartment building, which this particular owner has a lot of familiarity with that product and knows what to do with that. So that's an important attribute of this, is that each on its own bottom, each financially separable. And I should also just mention that condos are no longer a part of this scheme. They are no longer desired. They're no longer layer cake. There was a scheme we saw early on in which condos were sort of layer caked on, in a vertical mix. And I can just say, because we've tried to do a number of that kind of project in other places, it is really complicated when you have ownership units sitting on top of things that are going to have long-term different owners potentially. It gets to be really, really difficult, just financially, structurally, to make that work. And so it's really an apartment building. The buildings are situated above quite a large garage structure, which, by the way, includes an assumption of replacement parking for the abutters. And that's an important, we'll call it public benefit or community benefit, that the parking is not being abandoned, if you will, or those folks are not being abandoned to seek their own solutions. There's been a commitment made to do that. And I think it's, I'm 24-5 spaces, something like that. 24, I think. So of that 232, there's a portion of it that is dedicated to those folks. The multifamily program at 134 units, that's a small apartment building operationally. Frankly, I think part of what makes it work is the fact that you have an owner who has a portfolio of many more units, all proximate in the same general vicinity. And I think, but for that, we would say, ooh, that's pretty tiny. But I think that it's doable with the kind of ownership that we have in this situation. The hotel room count at 203 rooms, it's in the range for that upper upscale product. It's a little big. It's not 175 and it's not 150, but it is, again, operationally very attractive to the brands that are trying to deliver that product in this market to get into that 200-room category. So it's within the range of what's reasonable, I think. The commercial space is quite limited, 3,000 to 5,000 square feet. There's still some decision-making going on about how many square feet it will ultimately be, but it's quite targeted. It's on the corner of Waldo and Pleasant. It's not everywhere underneath the upper floors here, and there is likely to be some element of hotel, grab and go, or maybe even a bar, but that decision has yet to be made as well. What kind of ancillary public space, we'll call it, will be associated with the hotel part of this. Those are decisions that are not completely baked, let's just say. The public realm improvements here consist largely of what's happening in the outside, in the exterior, along that new shared connecting street between John Street and Pleasant Street, which is going to have wide sidewalks, landscaped areas for outdoor dining and seating. Portions of it are going to be able to be closed for the purposes of supporting public events. And as I mentioned before, there will be some element of co-work space in the apartment structure specifically as an amenity, both to the upstairs, but likely to be accessible in some form or fashion to others who may want a co-working space. Again, how it will be operated and by whom has not yet been firmed up. So, financial metrics, the land price. The land price here is actually lower than market. And that's, quite frankly, a function of how long the current ownership has had the control of the property. There is not, at least in the current pro formas, been any attempt to raise that land price up to the current market level. It is what it is. And frankly, that helps the economics a lot. Whereas in the other project, the land price cuts against feasibility. In this case, land price assists with feasibility. The development costs are consistent, again, with what we expect to see for over 70-foot construction, with the cost of underground parking. And here's the issue with 10 Waldo. On 1200 Beacon, it's the acquisition price, and here it's the cost of parking at almost $100,000 a space. And again, it's part of the reason why you're not rising land price up to market is because if you do that and you pay for parking, you have a serious problem in the pro forma. Ordinarily, when we're doing land analysis, we take any kind of a premium cost, like you might say is applicable to the parking cost here, and you say, well, that's really just de facto land value that's being redeployed to support the cost of those extraordinary parking spaces. But so it's definitely in that pro forma. That's the issue, is the cost of the parking. Yes.
Excuse me. In one of the iterations of this project, we saw that there was potentially not all below grade parking. There was going to be one level that would be at grade, and then I believe one level, and was that completely abandoned? Because in in one of the project designs we saw, I believe that was retained, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, I think there are basically two options that are being carried here.
One, is that a significant savings, one level?
Well, it definitely helps, and I think, as we'll talk about in a couple minutes, I think the parking here is a place to have a conversation. How many, for whom, how much do you build in the first instance, how much do you try to preserve for potentially, as the markets morph and change for others, perhaps, in Coolidge Corner. So, the way that parking is being handled and how many spaces are being delivered, I think is an area for conversation.
Is that likely part of the rationale toward rental?
No, I don't think so. Honestly, I think it's the ownership perspective. Right, is to own long-term, it's the way of going, right?
Aren't they proposing the parking ratios that you were saying were appropriate for the 1200?
So let's talk about the ratios. I'll just jump to that now because I know it's an important topic. The hotel ratios are right on the mark. They're like a 0.3, give or take. The residential ratios, once you extract the spaces for the condominium folks, is a little under a 1. Not a lot, but a little. It's a 1, give or take. Which, I think you would take the perspective that, or you could, that gives you the ability to go all in on that empty nester market. However, if you really believe that there's a bifurcated market here with some of both, it's probably more spaces than you would actually need to satisfy true demand. Now, the question I think one might ask is, since you have one shot at creating parking, is this a place where you might anticipate being able to have a broader shared solution than just shared within the project? We're sharing already with John Street condominium owners. I don't know. Far be it from me to suggest to you what the right answer is to this, but I just think that there's a part of, if you're going to flag things to talk about with the developer here, the nature of the parking solution, the number of spaces, for whom today, for whom tomorrow, that all seems to me to be a part of a piece. I think that it's interesting on the apartment revenue side of things, just like I feel more bullish about condo pricing at 1200 Beacon, I feel a little more bullish about rental pricing at 10 Waldo. I think, though, the rental rates are a little conservative and that there might be some more room there for more net income, for a somewhat higher rent per square foot than has been forecast, especially since this is early days for program, refinement. It's one thing to think about what the envelope is, but it's another thing to get down into the details of, well, X number of units at this square footage targeted to this market. There's certainly been some thinking along those lines, but, this is a design that is, in both cases, quite frankly, that is far from, fully vetted and evolved. And I think that, that as the program is further refined, there may be some more flex, if you will, in the pro formas, because of different attitudes perhaps about mix, about sizing, etc. The returns, both multifamily and hotel, they make the threshold as proposed. And, not by a lot, but they're on par with what one would need to see if you were expecting to have feasible product again. 2 projects, each on their own bottom, feasible each on a standalone basis. And I think that what that says to me, especially considering that there's a conversation to be had around parking, there's a conversation to be had around how the mix is actually going to unfold and whether there might be a little more revenue potential, I think there is room for a conversation here, which is quite different than I have said to you about 1200 Beacon, where it's just so difficult to make change on that project workable. In this case, there's room for, I think, a conversation on a variety of things as part of that larger conversation that is coming. This is the start of a conversation. This is not the end of a conversation by any means. And I think as you talk about various, trade-offs that you might be willing to accept in exchange for X, I think there's room in this one. Now, just because I did the same thing on the real estate taxes, let me tell you about real estate taxes on this one. The current parcels are generating about $200,000 a year in real estate taxes. About $90K at 10 Waldo and another $120K, give or take, at Durgan. Which simply goes to show that, the improvements, they aren't contributing much. The hotel tax, again, if you use the simple metrics that we were talking about before, sort of a translation of what we see at a modern hotel at 40 Webster, say 350 a key, 203 keys, the current commercial tax rate, that's $1.2 million in hotel taxes, equivalent, as if it were there today. If we look at the apartments, again, looking at the current pro forma, at the revenue rates that are being generated, I would expect that the apartments are going to generate something on the order of $4,000 to $5,000 per unit in real estate taxes. That's $500,000 to $600,000 in real estate taxes for the apartment structure. So $200K becomes $1.5 million, $1.6 million, somewhere in that ballpark. So quite a substantial difference in terms of the benefit on that front. So again, I think the messages here are that, I'd say just one final thing, and that is, I think that both of these developers have done a level job at presenting their economics the way that they exist, that are consistent with market. Nobody's, putting their thumb on the scale here. The presentations are true and honest, let's just say. What that enables in terms of the ongoing conversation is, however, quite different in each case. It's really a difference in how the acquisition price is hitting in one case and how the cost of underground parking and that solution influences overall economics in the other, again, among other things, like how that revenue stream is going to unfold as the design essentially evolves.
So how would this perform if the residential tower were reduced to a stick-on podium?
What happens is that the project gets to be too small, especially to support an underground parking requirement. So, I think that I've tested the rental apartment structure at a 7 stories. Essentially, what you're doing is you're cleaving the rental scheme. Again, this is just rough justice in my world. I'm not redesigning a project. I'm simply taking what is a 130-odd unit project. I'm cleaving it in 2, and you end up with a project, frankly, that no one would build. Not on a rental basis. It's too small to have critical mass to support the sort of ground floor amenity, to support the kind of parking arrangement that is it called for by the project. I think it's even if you thought you could bring the arithmetic into line, I guess is what I'm driving at here, and it doesn't really deliver the returns that are needed. They're subpar returns, but even if you could tweak the project to make the arithmetic work out, you still have a project that no one would build, in my opinion, just because of its sheer scale.
Just would add that while the net increment of excise tax may not be dramatic at 1200 Beacon because of the 50-room addition, adding 203 hotel rooms to a site that doesn't have any hotel rooms, if you do the math, $300 ADR times 75% occupancy times 6% times 203 rooms times 365 days is $1 million a year. So it's I didn't do that off my head. I have it.
That's really impressive.
It's not a rounding error. Excise tax is very meaningful, and that's always the bonus for building hotels as opposed to other uses.
Good point.
So just to
Yes.
go back to your prior point, I mean, those are very impressive numbers, but what you're saying is really to deviate from 14 stories in the rental, it would be very hard. I mean,
I guess what I'm suggesting is that the change that you might seek,
Yeah.
and again, far be it for me to say what change you should seek, whether it be, reducing the height a little, whether it be having a somewhat different approach to parking, whether it be having more open space contribution, those are all things that I think could be on the table as part of a conversation about how the project progresses through a permitting exercise. So I wouldn't say that thou shalt stick to 14 stories. That's the only
Right, but not 7,
That's the
right,
only
clearly.
solution.
Right.
I think you're going to have a conversation that
Right.
includes all of the above. And again, I don't think that it's having it all, maybe not so much. If you ask for the moon and every attribute, there's a point at which you put one too many sticks on the camel's back. But I do think that in a conversation about trade-offs, there could be some, it's a matter of choosing, and prioritizing, I think.
Linda? Or?
Oh, well, I was wondering about the, what you had mentioned about the size of the apartment building needing to be about the size that they're proposing, but then you also kind of qualified that by saying that's somewhat mitigated by the fact that the developer owns a lot of apartments in the vicinity, and this is the type of building they're used to building. So I'm wondering if there's any flexibility there, because to me, reducing the parking and reducing the size of that residential tower is my goal here. So,
Yeah, I mean, again, I think if you were going to take the perspective of what someone should want to build there, again, setting aside the town's aspirations, you'd build way more than 135 units. You'd be striving for, 200, 250. I mean, it's a site that is worthy of that kind of investment interest. Now, having said that, I think that there are things about that location and sort of thresholds for how small it can be to have it still, from a consumer's point of view, it still has to have the critical mass to be a bona fide multifamily residence. And there is a point, notwithstanding how much more product this particular developer owner may have in the neighborhood to mitigate scale, there's still a threshold below which, because imagine it from the perspective of, well, how am I going to sell this thing at some point in the future? Now, I mean, and I'm not suggesting at all that this particular owner has anything but an intention to hold, because that's attitudinally, there's a view about legacy holdings, but from a market point of view, one would never suggest that you simply rely on this particular owner's set of expectations for that decision. So you got to be mindful of what it means for a rational exit. Still has to be financeable. No, it's not. It's not nothing. It's just that it's not enough to be, let's call it institutional, grade, Class A product.
Does it help at all if you have micro units and less parking requirements?
Well, I mean, I think that it's less a function of.
Does it help? Well, I asked, does it help at all? I asked, does it help if you go to micro units with less parking requirements?
Well, I mean, I think anything that can reduce that cost of parking is very helpful, obviously, but there's still a size of envelope. Think about 300 square feet. And I would never suggest that anybody build 70 and certainly not 100 of micro units, just because the risk of the marketability of those long term is very dicey. I mean, I'm doing consulting right now for people who are trying to think about co-work and co-live space. And there's very much a resistance in the finance markets to projects that get above a certain bedroom count on that typology, just because people don't have confidence that that product is going to be desirable and marketable 10 years from now.
It's also higher square foot cost, right?
Well, you have bedrooms and bathrooms, or kitchens and bathrooms.
Fire-rated walls, I mean, the unit costs go up, I mean, the architects would know.
Right. Alan's been very patiently with us.
So I'm just looking at this, and right now you had said there, 134 apartment units here, and at one parking space per unit. So, did you study going down to a 0.5 ratio? Because it seems like there are a variety of impacts there. You could either get the parking garage closer to one level, one level plus a bit or stackers or something part of it, or you could reduce the height. And I'm curious what that matrix is of how those two things relate to each other, because we have some 8 and 10 story buildings that are close by, and it seems like there's a sweet spot that's closer to that, maybe.
Yeah, I get, I'll just say a couple of things about it, because I think it's hard to get precision about the monetary trade-offs here. I mean, you can analyze it as I have sort of in rough terms. But what happens is, as you reduce the height below a certain threshold, is that you stop being able to amortize those higher construction costs. Because there are a certain number of fixed costs that have to be borne here no matter what. And what we find is that below 70 feet, those economics, you can figure out how to make those economics work, typically. Again, as long as you don't have to build underground parking. And then there's a delta between 70 feet and 14 or 15 stories where the economics are ugly. Sort of the worst possible thing you can do from an economic point of view is to be in the 9, 10, 11 story realm, because you're getting neither the benefit of the revenue stream that you have access to if you're building taller, nor do you have the cost savings associated with the lower height building. So it's interesting. It's unless you can generate very high rent per foot. So just let me give you an example. Seaport. Take Seaport for example, where you have the FAA height restrictions limiting how tall buildings can be. Those projects, they're getting $5.50 to $5.75, going to $6 per square foot per month. So a 1,000 square foot unit is a $6,000 rent or a $5,000 rent. Now, with that kind of revenue power, you can pay for underground parking, you can pay for rooftop swimming pools, you can pay for a lot of amenity value in spite of the fact that the heights are kind of tweener and not particularly remunerative. But in a place where the rents are more like $4 a foot, which is really $4 to $4.25 a foot. And still, that's a lot of money. It's quite difficult to make the economics work for that kind of tweener height. Now, that doesn't mean that at 14 stories, there might not be some room with some thought about how you might deal differently with parking, etc., to maybe, I don't know, again, shave a little bit off the top, but to think that you're going to go from 14 down to 9, I think is probably not realistic.
Okay. Roger.
Very interesting. Well, Dan, thanks. Just a very few specific questions. This is, I guess, based upon the very tight economics at 1,200 relating to the condos.
Speak up.
I've got laryngitis.
Oh, sorry.
That's all I can. Maybe a little better. How's that? The condos are, for typical ones and twos, they're more generously spaced than the rentals by about how much would that be?
Average, I'm sorry, let me, so I don't shoot from the hip here. The average size for condo units at 1,200 is about 1,200 square feet per unit. That's the average. So ones are smaller,
Yeah.
twos are bigger.
I'm wondering in the workup of the economics on the 15% affordable, which I think was built in that particular
Yes.
percentage, did the numbers take account of the fact that those units can be smaller?
At the moment, it's expressed as an equal distribution throughout the property. The pricing for those, for the affordables in 1,200 is around $190 a foot.
Right, so the economics might loosen up a little bit. I'm just thinking if
Yep.
it's so tight, if it were taken into account that the 15% component, they could be smaller units.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly would help, but I guess the question is, given how few units that is, I mean, think about how much envelope we're talking about. 15 units of only a part of the project, right? And given how far underwater that is,
Yeah.
it's hard. I mean, might it help to justify some kind of a change?
Yeah.
Perhaps, but for example, I think the idea that it would help you fuel an ask for much lower density.
No, I'm only thinking
Yeah.
at the margin.
Yeah,
That's
right.
one place.
Yeah,
If it's
yeah, yeah.
really tight or even questionably feasible as proposed, that might make it
Yeah, I mean, I
slightly
think,
more attractive.
just as a general matter, I mean, the affordability requirements are hitting both of these projects in a pretty serious way, right? And so, that's an area, just like parking, I suppose, where you could have a conversation about whether or not there are changes that could be, could be thought about that would help the impact, not eliminating them, but might help the impact of that particular attribute. Yep.
Okay, any other questions from the committee? We've been at this for 2 hours, and I did put the word out that we would probably not have time for public comment, and I think that's kind of happened. But the work of the committee now is going to get project-specific, applying what we've seen here. I think this has been very interesting, if dense. But this is complicated stuff, right? We just need to do one housekeeping thing, and that's the minutes from the last meeting, which was distributed. So if we can take a quick look, and then I'll have a motion to accept the minutes.
I'll move to accept the minutes.
Okay. All those in favor? Okay, it's unanimous. And, okay, thank you very much. Thank you for sitting through this.
Thanks, Pam.
Thank you.
It's like a root canal.